ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this joint policy exchange and inclusion event on NEET and youth unemployment. NEET, once upon a time, was a rather dry statistical category, but it's become an increasingly well-recognised phenomenon and social problem. The government in CSR pledged to do a number of things to try and tackle this problem. They talked about the role of what they would be doing for young people within the work programme. They have a new programme called Youth Action for Work. They talked about more apprenticeships, more FE college places. One of the things we'll be talking about today is whether this is enough. We have an extremely distinguished panel of people to kick off the discussion here today. We're going to have some speeches to start with, and then questions and answers with all of you too. The first speaker will be Damien Hyde, who's the Conservative MP for East Hampshire. He's a proper policy wonk. He was former chairman of the Bow Group. He was been on the Education Select Committee. We're then going to have Ginny Lunn, who is the Director for Policy and Development at the Prince's Trust. And she's going to be talking a bit about the costs to our economy of having people, young people who are not in work. We're then going to have comments from Maureen McKerricker, who is the Associate Director for Strategy and Performance at UKCES. And she's going to talk a little bit about the kind of the employer's perspective and what they are looking for. And to round off the discussion, we will have a contribution from Terry Rooney, who is, as you all know, the former chair of the DWP Select Committee. Before I start, can I thank Serco very much, who sponsored this event and made it possible, and also thank Inclusion, who are great partners to work with on all this stuff, and bang good expertise. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Damien to tell us a little bit about what the government are doing about NEET.
Thank you very much. Thank you. A proper walk. Not very proper. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll keep my remarks brief because I think the beauty of these sessions is always in the interaction. Is there a problem? Clearly there is. That's why we're all here. 900,000 odd young people not in employment, educational training. The result of an amazing rebranding exercise, of course, because when I was young, these people were called youth unemployed. But now they're sort of much more cuddly sounding needs, but it's no less of a problem. And estimates vary that perhaps each of these people, as a result, has a lifetime cost to the public purse, effectively to everybody else, of something close to £100,000. But quite apart from that, quite apart from the money, it's just such wasted talent, wasted potential, and unfortunate lives. The question is, where do you start? Because if you start with today's young NEET population, you'll always be a generation late. On the other hand, if you start by looking at people who are sort of 0 to 16 today, it will take you a generation to do anything. So you have to do both at the same time. Plus there's also, of course, the point that the generations are interdependent. So how today's young people and children grow up is in part dependent on what they see around them, what they see in their homes and their communities. But that next generation challenge is actually not just about individuals, it's also about, I think, us as a society, and it's about British industry and how we aspire to develop the economy in such a way that everybody's talents are fully utilised. Now, we could talk about lots of different aspects, and I'm sure over the course of the session we will. I'm not going to try and cover everything by any means. And specifically, I'm going to skip things like apprenticeships, the work programme, and exciting and important things on benefit reform, in particular the universal credit. I'm sure other colleagues will talk about those things. Because I sit on the Education Committee, perhaps this is the reason I'm particularly motivated to talk in this area, but I want to talk more about what happens before the age of 18 or before the age of 16. And I'm going to simplify it massively by suggesting there are 4 things to care about, 4 things to be worried about. The first is about how we stimulate aspiration in young people. The second is about the curriculum and keeping people stimulated and engaged. The third is about care and management of young people's sort of pre-career careers, especially when things go wrong. And the fourth is making sure that everybody involved in education and throughout the public sector recognises and acts on the principle that every child really does matter. In terms of aspiration, I think this is where a lot of the problem starts, is the feeling that for a lot of kids, you see jobs, you see people doing things on telly and what have you, and it's just, it's not for me. And careers advice obviously has a really important role to play in this. And I think, actually, candidly, in schools, a lot of careers advice is pretty poor and has been for quite a long time. We visited with the Select Committee. We visited a school last week, and they did something quite interesting, and I believe this is more and more common in schools where at sort of age 11 or 12, they say, right, pick your university. And the children will then, work out where it is, how they would get from this, in this case it was Leicester, how they would get from Leicester to Cambridge or whatever it is, what subject they'd like to study and what things they'd get involved. It doesn't mean they're necessarily going to Cambridge, but it means that from a very early age they're taught and they're encouraged to think big, to think I can do things rather than I can't do things. There's also lots of roles for role models and mentors, and many people in the voluntary sector do brilliant work in that sphere. I don't think these are things for government to get stuck into directly, but they are things for government to support. And also we need to see more business involvement in schools. Actually, things like The Apprentice, so it may sound flippant, but actually having these things on the telly are actually very good news for young people's aspiration and for the potential to want to become an entrepreneur and become a successful business person, but we need to be more direct. The second thing is about the curriculum and how you keep, kids' minds wander, let's be honest. You need to keep people engaged in school, and that requires different things for different children, different young people. And of course this is going to become much more of a challenge when the participation goes up to 18, and anybody who's married to a teacher, as I am, your wife or husband will tell you the prospect of being stood in front of a class of 30, 17-year-old boys who do not want to be there is quite a scary prospect. So making the curriculum ever more relevant and engaging is very important. The whole kind of vocational educational and training routes in this country have I think for too long been a second-class citizen. It's a sort of easy thing to say and so on. But there are examples of where this isn't the case. In particular, Germany is an example which is often held up. And I see no reason why in that particular aspect alone it wouldn't be a good idea to follow Germany. But also the qualifications need to be streamlined and they need to be understood. Before I became an MP, I was an employer in the hotel and catering trade. And one of the difficulties that you have is there are so many of these damn things that it's impossible, pretty much, to understand the full range and what they all mean and what kind of levels of skill they deliver and guarantee. So that needs to be streamlined and cleared up too. But none of this means that you can avoid the basics of academic education. And I'm afraid there are some people in the education establishment who think spelling is optional. It isn't. And in fact, as the economy develops, and I probably won't have time to talk about this in my remarks today, but as the economy develops towards the knowledge industries, towards high-tech engineering and pharma and all these sorts of things, actually just having good sort of pure vocational skills for a very large swathe of the population will not be enough, because there's a fundamental economic reason here. We will never make t-shirts cheaper than China again. So if we want to compete in certain sectors in the economy, it has to be things where we're not just competing on unit labour costs, and that does imply having higher levels of interpersonal skills and some of these academic things as well. In terms of care and management, there are a number of points in a child's life where things can kind of go wrong. People can slip through the cracks, and somebody who was previously doing well suddenly does rather badly. An obvious one is, of course, the transition between primary school and secondary school, where some kids effectively seem to sort of somehow lose 6 months of their development overnight. It's been, people talk about going from this place where everyone knows everybody, it's a nurturing, caring environment, to suddenly you're in the jungle, as a tiny little sort of cog in this big machine. There's what happens to people when they get into trouble. How quickly can you get them back on track? And if people are persistently truant, how hard do you try to make sure they don't just then drop out of school altogether? And if kids are excluded, then what happens in terms of their next placement, whether it's a managed move to another school or into a pupil referral unit? And PRUs actually can be excellent. Again, we visited a particularly good one in Lewisham a couple of weeks ago, but too many, I think, don't come up to the mark. And finally, on education, the important point that everyone matters, and this sounds like a very glib thing to say, and of course everybody believes that everybody matters. That's not how we measure schools, ladies and gentlemen. We measure schools by the number of children who reach an arbitrary benchmark of having achieved 5 GCSEs at grade C or above, including English and Maths. Now the problem with that is anybody you speak to in education, give them a couple of drinks, and then by that point, they will admit that the result of that means that if you have a limited amount of time, and everybody has a limited amount of time, and you're going to decide who to focus the school's effort on, of course you're going to focus on the kids who are currently predicted to get 3 grade Ds and 2 grade Cs to try and get them up to the benchmark. And we don't put nearly enough emphasis on getting kids who previously might get a grade E to get to a grade D. That might be the greatest achievement they make in life, and it'd be well worth doing. We don't put nearly enough emphasis on value added that the school is adding. So whatever the intake you have, what do you do with them to turn them into something better at the other end? And we've managed to massively overcomplicate this system with contextual value added so that nobody understands. But anybody that's really understands it, raise your hand now, and I'll take you out for a beer afterwards. You can explain it to me. It's far too complicated. And I would personally like to see every child leaving school with some certification of their achievement, which is not necessarily just academic achievement, but all the things they might have done. They might have done voluntary work, they might have excelled in sport, or whatever it is, so that everybody has an acknowledgement of their work. We could start even earlier than secondary school. You could talk about primary school. Some would tell you the die is cast by age 5. And so, I really welcome the extensions of early years provision. I welcome the pupil premium, and I particularly welcome the government committing on a cross-party basis to looking into early intervention in all its guises. Because what worries me most is that when you talk to people individually around the country about these areas, you hear lots and lots of good ideas of how you can take children at the very youngest ages and help them to not be someone who's going to drop out of the system and eventually become a NEET. The problem is there's not nearly enough sharing of good practice. And although there's a brilliant idea over there and a brilliant idea over there, I don't know where the intellectual property repository is. Might be with College Exchange. But we need to have a lot more cross-sharing of this. We need to deploy what we do know from the field on a much broader basis. I think I've probably spoken long enough, so I will stop there, but I will look forward to hearing from colleagues and from you later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Please do, if you're at the back, please do come forward and have a seat. There's plenty of seats in the front here. Don't do rest your legs. Lots to think about there. Over to you, Ginny.
Yeah, thank you. Shall I move my bag?
Every chair counts.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I've been looking forward to this discussion because I don't know how many people know, but the Prince's Trust, this is core work for the Prince's Trust to try and help young people back into education, training and employment. We work with over 44,000 young people each year, but actually that's nothing compared to the amount of young people who are, as Damien said, in situations of what we call NEET. It's a term I don't like, it's a term that young people don't like, but it seems to have stuck, we all know what we're talking about. But I think for me it's also really important that we remember the stories of who are these young people. And the Prince's Trust has something called Celebrate Success, which is all about celebrating the achievements of young people. It's an award ceremony, happens all over the country. And we have a ceremony in London in March. But last week I was in Leeds, where we held one of our events, and I was talking to a young woman there who, 2 years ago, she was homeless, she was on the streets, she was selling drugs, she had wasn't engaged in any kind of education, training or anything, typical young person that we work with. And so we came in touch with her, we offered her a place on one of our programs, and now a year later, she always said she wanted to work. She did have the aspiration to work, but obviously she didn't know how to get there at all, and she said her dream job would be to work on a cruise ship. So talking to her, she said that she came across Cunard, who are one of our supporters, and just last week was offered a job, so she'll be heading off to the Caribbean in January. So, I think we often think that young people don't want to work. There's all these young people that are living in communities, workless households, but actually they are really wanting that support, wanting that help to help them get out of this situation and take the jobs that are there. And I think it's our responsibility to help young people to get to that situation. So I think you all know the figures, we've talked about that, about 900,000 young people currently in the category of not in education, training or employment. I think a more worrying figure is that we have now the highest number of long-term unemployed young people we've had for 16 years. So it really is an issue that we need to be taking note of. And the coalition government, as we know, David mentioned, we have all the welfare reforms, lots of new things coming on, but I think it is so important that we make sure that we're working with government, working in the field, making sure that young people are going to benefit from things that are put in place. So I was asked briefly to talk a bit about the cost of exclusion. I don't know, we produced a report in 2007 called The Cost of Exclusion, counting the cost of youth disadvantage in the UK. We're about to relaunch that, so it is actually due out in the next couple of weeks, which will be updated figures. But just to give you a few statistics, stark statistics, that in 2007, the cost of job seekers allowance to the state was 20 million a week. Well, that's obviously more now, but that is a cost of 20 million a week, and that's just job seekers allowance. It doesn't include housing benefit and all the other benefits. Cost of youth crime is 1 billion a year, which takes into account courts, police, all the associated costs of a young person being associated with the youth justice system. People may know the figure of it's between 47,000 and 130,000 to lock a young person up, which is a huge cost to the state. And as Damon was talking about education, excluding a young person, paying for them to attend a pupil referral unit can be between £3,000 and £5,000 a year. So they're huge costs to the economy. But on top of that, there's also the costs to the individual. There's been lots written about the cost of mental health, depression, not being engaged, how it demotivates, lack of confidence, all these other associated costs to that individual are really important to consider. We also do a report called the Youth Index, which is looking at young people and how they feel about their lives. And it's not a surprise, but young people who are in this category of not in education, training and employment are, the figure is twice as likely to feel down or depressed as their peers who are not NEET. So it's not surprising, but obviously we want to prevent this situation continuing. So what more could we do? I think we're all here because we're interested in what more can be done to address this issue. Recently we asked 17,000 young people who are not in education, training and employment, what are the biggest barriers that are stopping you? And 25% said it was the fact that they felt they had real issues with literacy and numeracy. And we know how many young people are leaving primary school really struggling. You know, it's a real barrier for them. Other things are increasing mental health problems amongst young people, their lack of confidence, housing, a real issue. You know, with the reforms to housing benefit, it's putting a lot of people under pressure, wondering what their situation is going to be like. Skills and qualifications already come up. Young people having not enough qualifications or skills to get, this is how they feel, that they won't get a job. Family problems, not having had work experience, no support, no opportunities. I've worked in the sector with young people for 20 years. It's not, none of it's rocket science, but it still does exist today. And what we try and do is provide things that are going to address those issues. And just back to the costs, we have a program called Excel which works in schools, and it works with those young people that are at risk of exclusion. It costs the school £2,000 for 15 young people to be a part of that club, which is approximately £66 a year. That's how, you know, reasonable it is compared to the cost of, say, £3,000 to exclude a young person. So, you know, I think what we're trying to do is show how little it can be to sort of really engage, keep a young person in school, in education, doing things that are really positive compared to the cost of sending them into the youth justice system, custody, whatever. Another program we have is TEAM, 12 weeks, based in local community, engages unemployed young people. That costs us £3,226 for a 12-week program for one young person. We work with around 7,000 young people a year. If we kept 25% of those out of custody, that saves the state £82 million. That's huge. I mean, it's absolutely massive. So to work with the same number, it costs 7% of that. So it's about £5 million. So we can do something really positive for £5 million, which would cost the state 80 million, so they have to lock them up. So my messages to government would be, and I know we're asked to kind of wrap up with some messages, is we've really got to crack this whole invest to save, to really get that message across. And we're doing some work, social return on investment, it's really big at the moment. But I think it's useful to be really joining up on that message to say it just makes sense to invest now to prevent all these issues in the future. And I think Damien said it, but I would agree with the whole making sure education works for all. We see so many young people struggle and it creates so many problems later in life. So it's making sure education really works for all young people. Thank you.
Judy, thank you. Some very compelling numbers there about the cost of inaction. And Moira, I think you're going to talk a little bit more about what employers actually want and how we might get them to take up more young people.
Thank you. Yes, I am. I'm from the UK Commission for Employment and Skills, and our commissioners are really a social partnership, if you like, of large and small employers, trade union representatives and third sector representatives. They've been concerned since the start of the recession about the effect on young people and rising youth unemployment, and DWP, who are a co-sponsor of ours, are also interested to know how their recent initiatives, particularly ones like the Young Persons Guarantee Scheme, has worked from the employer's point of view. So because of that, we've been doing some digging in this area. We've been doing some work on employability, and we've looked at a number of our evidence sources, the massive employer surveys that we do, and we've combined that with in-depth follow-up with individual employers. So we know the background to all this. Compared to other OECD countries, the UK is doing better than average on youth unemployment. And consistently across these countries, youth unemployment rates always run higher than adults. But in this recession, even compared to other disadvantaged groups in the labour market, young people seem to be disproportionately affected. So why is that? Well, some evidence that the positive flexibility that employers have shown to avoid making redundancies, like cutting or freezing pay, reducing hours, offering unpaid leave, effectively hoarding their labour, has reduced entry opportunities for young people. And demographic factors are there too. Numbers of 18 to 24-year-olds in Britain has risen by almost 1 million in the last 10 years to 7.4 million. So this intensifies the competition that young people face. We know that those who are in the NEET category vary by skill level. Around 7% have degrees, 13% have A-levels or equivalent, 33% have 5 GCSEs, but around half have either no or very low qualifications. And although the impact of the recession on graduate employment is a cause for concern, experience tells us that graduates are likely to do better than non-graduates when the economy recovers. And I guess it shouldn't distract us from the long-term structural problem we seem to have of this group, this stubborn 36% of those young people with no qualifications who are not in employment, education or training. And that's unlikely then, it's a long-term problem, unlikely to go away even when things pick up in the economy. We all know about the effects of youth unemployment, the scarring effects on individuals and on society. We've heard about the costs. And added to those challenges, the nature of work is changing, and that is affecting young people particularly. How's it doing that? Well, there's the underemployment, for example, in terms of hours. 10% of all people of working age are underemployed. But for 18 to 24-year-olds, that's higher. It's 17.6%. And for 16 to 17-year-olds who are underemployed, it climbs to 22.4%. So these people are working fewer hours than they would want to. And this also increases the chances of a jobless recovery, as it's sometimes called, as employers they've got lots of scope to raise output by simply raising hours of their staff rather than hiring new people. And this will have a knock-on effect for young people. Temporary work is on the rise, and again, younger people, for younger workers, the proportion is much higher who are on temporary contracts. The numbers of employers who are recruiting school leavers is steadily dropping. Partly in response to the recession, but actually recruitment of school leavers seems to be on a downward trend. 8% of employers in 2005 recruited them, compared to 7% in 2007 and just over 5% in 2009. So we're seeing numbers of employers who are recruiting school leavers dropping. There's a general decline in employees who are receiving training, but again, young people are being disproportionately affected by that. And again, decline in relative earnings. So earnings have been increasing steadily for all age groups, but the gap between younger and older workers is widening. So lots of challenges there, even in the way that work is changing for young people. And so very good reasons why we should focus policy efforts on this. So when we looked at employers' views of recruitment of young people, we found some things that were quite surprising actually, and kind of counterintuitive and counter to sometimes what the press might say. Only a minority of employers actually take young people on straight from education. Just 22% of employers actually take on young people directly from education into their first job. Now that varies between the age cohorts, but it's actually, when we're thinking about employers, only 22% at the moment are taking young people into their first job. And those that do take them on generally find that they're well prepared for work. That doesn't make a Daily Mail headline, but it's what we've found. But employers' views of young persons' preparedness for work improves the longer their young recruits have been in education. So satisfaction levels go up the longer young people have been in education. Reasons why employers found young people not well prepared for work were a mix of experience, skills and attributes. But overwhelmingly, the cause was lack of experience. No great surprise there, you might say. However, lack of skills and attitudes and motivation are cited by between a third and a half of employers who take young people on and who had some dissatisfaction. Actually, the amount of employers who take young people and who had issues about literacy and numeracy were fairly small. They made up a fairly small proportion. But employability skills, those broad transferable skills, which include literacy, numeracy and ICT, but also include personal skills like self-management, communication, and overwhelmingly a positive attitude and desire to succeed. These are the ones that if you ask employers what's their single biggest skills issue, that's the one that come out. Aesthetic skills are also becoming quite important, and that's about the need to kind of look good and sound right in the modern workplace, and that's because of the expansion of customer service related work and the fact that employees are now often regarded as a crucial part of the product or the service that they sell. It's quite interesting to compare what employers think of young people with what young people think about their own chances in the job market. We've heard some of that from Ginny. But Reading Partnership's done a massive piece of research recently and just updated it. And, despite all the challenges that are out there, they're finding that young people remain highly motivated. They're now more willing to do unpaid work compared to last year, which is good news in terms of the fact that experience is such a big issue for them, or lack of it. Their confidence is improving. Around 65% felt that they would work within the next 3 months. And young people don't tend to see their skills as such a barrier. And that view contrasts, of course, with what employers think. Although interestingly, young people get less confident about their skills the older they get, so maybe reality starts to kick in when they engage with the labour market. And where young people and employers agree is on the importance of work experience. Employers find that the main reason they're dissatisfied with young people is a lack of experience, and young unemployed people that Reed in partnership spoke to said that lack of experience was the biggest barrier they faced to getting work. And finally then, what do we think are some things that might be done to encourage employers to take on more young people? Well, there's quite a number of ideas that we have, but just to combine it to a few. First of all, it's really important to have a simple and concise ask and offer to employers. So what are we asking of them and what are we offering them by way of support? And stick with it over a period of time. I think when the Young Persons Guarantee Scheme and the Backing Young Britain scheme was launched, there were about 7 strands to it. Later this was simplified down to 3. Work experience or internships, apprenticeships, or a job. And I think if we stick with these 3 simple categories and are very clear about what support's on offer, if any, for employers to incentivise them to take on young people, that will be really important, because that will help with the communication of messages. And this is another issue. There's very low awareness when we asked employers about the support initiatives, very low awareness for anything other than the tried and tested brands like apprenticeships. Low awareness of the other offers. We need to get smarter about communicating messages to employers, and that goes for organisations like ourselves. So national campaigns have very limited effect and they're very expensive. We can use smarter ways to communicate messages. Small companies in particular need to be targeted, and indeed if there's whatever public money there is for supporting employers needs to be very carefully targeted in terms of size of employers and sectors. A lot of the experiences from the recent initiatives were well thought of by employers. They like apprenticeships, they like the pre-employment training and routes into work in sector group ways. So their experience when they did use the programmes was generally positive. So more of this type of thing is good. Employability skills, we mentioned the issue with schools and the link. It's so important for schools and all learning providers to have good links with employers and give the staff and the learners a chance to be really up to date with what's happening in the world of work. But I guess the final big points are maintain economic growth. All of the employers said the biggest thing that would incentivise them to take on more young people is if their business picked up. And we think, and employers, our commissioners agree that employers have a responsibility here as well to increase the demand for skills. So within their own sectors, they need to be thinking collectively about how they can raise skill levels within their sectors. And that's about lots of things. It's about creating clear work-based training pathways and progression opportunities, and a whole range of measures like occupational licensing, minimum professional standards, levies, voluntary codes. Employers within their sectors know what's going to work best for them and their employers. And that should open more doors for young people to take a work-based route to qualification. Finally, and we might see this through the new work programme and the universal credit, the tax and benefit system has to be responsive to the changes to the new type of labour market we have, so that the system encourages young people to take shorter hours contracts, makes it easy for them to do so, and to take temporary positions. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think it's a very good point there, thinking about the importance of having a simple system and sticking with it. Our next speaker, Terry, has vast amount of experience across all these different issues. So I don't know if you want to use the word.
I don't know about the vast experience, but here goes. I think the 2 or 3 speakers have touched on this, that I think we still don't understand who are needs and how that breaks down. Regionally, the number of needs closely matches the claimant count. But in every other aspect, there's no regular pattern that you can identify. There's some very interesting differences, I think they're interesting anyway, in gender and in ethnicity. But when we talk about this 900,000, I think we need to remember a couple of things that often get overlooked. There are an estimated, and admittedly this is from sort of age 10 to 18, there is an estimated 200,000 child carers in this country. Now it's no surprise that they're perhaps somewhat removed from the labour market. There are around, 300,000. 200,000 carers. There are 300,000 children, again admittedly that's not to 18, who are not living with their parents, but are not in official care. 300,000. Now, we know that children that have been in state care do extremely badly at the education system. So, is it any surprise that, or would it be any surprise if that 300,000 who are not living with their biological parents would suffer similar, if not to the same extent, issues? I think we really do need to try and get beneath this 900,000 figure and just try and understand those differences. I would just say that really what we should be talking about today is employment. Because the numbers not in education and training has been falling year on year on year. It's the numbers not in work that's been increasing. So I think perhaps a more focus needs to be around that employment issue. Somebody's looking absent there, but I'll give you the figures afterwards if you want. I think it's about 9 years running, the numbers not in education and training has been falling. But that unemployment issue has been increasing, and especially so over the last 2 years. Now, I think it's fair to say that generally, parental aspiration and influence on the children is a key element in this. But I have to say, we need to remember that the 16 to 18-year-olds of today, their parents were children in the 80s and early 90s recession when unemployment hit 3 million. When we had myriad schemes, and that's all were frankly schemes, to take people off the claimant count. So you had YOPS, YTS, the MSC, and later the New Deal. And I think for those parents, they will be giving very little credibility to any scheme that is put forward by any government, based on the experiences that they had and their parents had in those traumatic years, say 80 to 95. So I think we need to bear that in mind. And I remember the great fanfare that the New Deal was launched with in '98. Thousands and thousands and thousands of employers signed up to it. Initially, very positively received, particularly by young people, but it didn't last long. The message that was given out was there was no fifth option. You had the 4 options, there was no fifth option, but there was a fifth option. It was either crime or just dropping out altogether, or using the system, playing around for you 3 months, then when you're supposed to be going on it, sign off, sign back in again 3 weeks later. And if the programs, whatever they might be, do not have that credibility, young people are not daft. They will do what's necessary to meet the requirements, but there won't be that inbuilt enthusiasm that means it will work. That I think is really, really crucial is that. We talked already about the increasing numbers of young unemployed and more worryingly, long-term unemployed. But next summer, just think about this, there'll be 300,000 graduates leaving university. There'll be 800,000 kids leaving school. 1.1 million people coming into the labour market next summer. In the whole of 2011, about 700,000 people will retire. We're told, don't know how many, but we're told there will be significant redundancies in the public sector, which has been a more traditional route for taking hardest to place people, particularly young people. So that's not a good omen for where we're going to be in 12 months' time. And, you know, I honestly wish every success to the work programme when we see the detail. But at the end of the day, if there are no jobs for people at the end of whatever that programme is, what we've got now will just be exacerbated in 12 months' time and will be affecting even more numbers. And yeah, there is, I think, in other spheres, I call this psychological warfare, because already it's setting in people's minds that there are no jobs. And this just isn't true. You know, there are jobs, there are people coming off the claiming of the benefit roll every month in tens, if not hundreds of thousands of going into employment. It's an equal or greater number coming into the benefit system because they've lost their jobs. But to say there are no jobs at all is just not true. But there is that perception, I have to say, wrongly, constantly reiterated by people in the press and media. But that perception is now gaining ground. And young people, particularly, think, what's the point? Why should I sign up for this? You know, I have to say, I think it's tragic that educational maintenance allowance has been abolished. Because I think as an instrument of particularly social mobility and getting people from working class homes without that background and history of further and higher education, you know, that was one of the most spectacular success, particularly with boys, that there was. And the problem with people from poor households getting to university was never lack of brain power, it was getting them to actually stay on into the sixth form in the first place. And that £30 a week certainly worked. Who knows what the long-term effect will be of the changes in tuition fees. As you know, 4 or 5 years ago when they went to 3,000 there was a big outcry and the numbers applying to university have actually gone up. I can't believe that trebling it means the work forward rules. But again, that may have some impact. I think the abolition of train to gain, why employers have not kicked an even bigger stink about this beats me. Because that again was a fundamental element of the skills agenda. So that's just sort of my sort of take on these things. I do worry about the speed of moving to the new work programme without any sort of evaluation of how flexible New Deal has gone, which was welcomed by, insofar as these things ever are welcomed, it was welcomed by providers, that new flexibility, the black box approach, and I think, you know, perhaps an evaluation of where that was before moving into what is very much unknown territory. But at the end of the day, all these things will only happen and make a difference if we have some sort of partnership between schools, FE colleges and employers. Because at the end of the day, 2 of those provide the education and training and the 3rd one provides the jobs. Without jobs, all of it falls. I was interested in the polite way you talked about things, but you know, if there is not the demand and the spending power in the economy, then the jobs will not be there. Any jobs that are there are much more likely to go to somebody who's got experience and or skills. School leavers, new graduates tend to be at the back of the queue, and that only further exacerbates that problem. I don't think it helps when we see phrases repeated, like work, shine, lifestyle choice. I don't know any 17 or 18-year-old who thinks it's a lifestyle choice to live on £47 a week. I think, you know, we can do with that. There is the odd one, there might even be the odd thousand or so. The vast majority of the people we're talking about That's not a lifestyle choice they have made or want to make. So in the end, this is about jobs. Much bigger issue in the the education and training. Important though that is, the real area of focus is those that are unemployed. Early interventions would matter long term. I think it could be another 20 to 30 years before we really know the effect of those high levels of unemployment in the 80s and 90s. That means it's 40 to 50 years before we know the effect of what's happening today. What we need to do is focus all our energies and intelligence and our inspiration, our good feelings into taking this group of young people forward. Because what we do know is there is a hell of a cost. We might not be able to quantify it, but we do know there's a hell of a cost. And that cost is then visited on tomorrow's generation. And those that are in primary school today are having their thoughts influenced by what's happening to their parents, their older brothers and sisters. So it's a huge, huge issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Terry. I was struck your point about the high levels of unemployment and they can persist. Looking at the last national statistics release, the good news is that the unemployment rate for 16 to 18-year-old men had fallen by 7% in the last 3 months, which sounds very impressive. But the bad news is it's fallen from 44% to 37%. So I mean, it really is enormously high. We've got time for questions and answers from all of you now. If you could really kindly tell us who you are, where you're from, that would be great. And if there's anyone on the panel you particularly want to answer the question. And also there's a roving mic. So there's a gentleman at the very back there.
Hi, it's Gunnar Mason from Morrison's. Sorry, Terry, it was a look of realisation, not a look of doubt I gave you. I know you know our business very well. We've got 40,000 16 to 24-year-olds and another 20,000 jobs over the next 3 years, so we hope that we can be a small part of that solution. We use pre-employment academies, apprenticeships and a general retail skills programme which gives QCF or the old NVQ level 2. We've also started a new degree programme now in the manufacturing section of our business, in the food manufacturing, where we pay students a wage each year and we pay their fees as well at university. David, you mentioned the role of private sector employers in this. I'm just wondering, is there one of those things that you'd like us to do or to do more of? Is it more apprenticeships? Is it better qualifications? Is it more degree programs? Is there one specific aspect that you'd like to see employers do a lot more of?
You did miss one thing out, and that's your programme with the management sector.
Yeah, sorry. MBAs, yeah.
You did a good advertising. Well, I think actually retail is interesting because I don't know what your company's rate is, but we're talking somewhere around 22% turnover of staff in retail, which is huge when you think of these 3 million that are employed there. The good news is that's constantly throwing up opportunities. The bad news is most retailers do not employ somebody to have a career. They employ somebody to man a till or stack a shelf or whatever. And they do not talk to people about career in retail. And there is much more to the retail trade than just simply taking the money at the till. And you've highlighted some of the good things that you're doing. Now, I think the larger the employer, the more they have a social responsibility to engage in things. Now, things like the local employer partnerships, people laugh, but there are about 250,000 jobs came through those. Morrison's, and I think it's Tesco, always hand over to Job Centre Plus the recruitment for their new stores. Let them do all the pre-screening and everything, but they basically take from the claim account, which I think is fantastic. And I just think you need to do more of what you are doing, and what government needs to do is to get your competitors to engage in the same way.
David, you wanted to?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think your company is really doing a great deal, and I would echo those comments in terms of persuading others to do likewise, particularly smaller organisations for whom obviously it's a different sort of risk actually. and it's more of a lumpy thing to take on, but nevertheless very, very important. The thing I really wanted to come back on actually was the point about retail not being a career. Actually, I think to be fair, a number of the supermarket groups, not only Morrison's but others as well, actually these days really is a career, and you meet a lot of people who are store managers and so on who started stacking shelves. But there's still, in this country, we do have a cultural problem with retail, and in my old business, which was pubs and hotels, I remember a school, we were on a stag do once, terrible, a school friend of mine said to me, have you ever noticed how when you're served a drink in France, you feel you're being served it by someone who's proud of their career, and when you're served the same drink in England, you feel like you're being served by someone on a gap year. And there is a real element of that it is possible in France and Germany and Belgium and Holland and so on, to be a barman for life, and be a brilliant barman, and be very proud of being a barman, do you know what I mean? And so on. Whereas in this country there are a number of jobs which we do kind of treat as being sort of jobs you do in passing before you go on to something else. And I don't know quite what the answer is, but I would love to see guilds and trade associations and so on really playing a leading role in elevating the role of careers in retail, careers in hospitality and so on.
Any other questions? Is one at the front here, then we'll come to the back, and then over there.
Hello, I'm Joe, and I'm from the Young People's Enterprise Partnership, which is actually currently funded by the Regional Development Agency in the West Midlands. Yes, so how long it's going to continue is up for debate. What we do is we look at, through research, opportunities for young people in the West Midlands. And the issue that seems to be risen here, really, for me, is that given the demographic factors, given the people entering the labour force, all those kind of things, and combine that with maybe a drive towards localism and those kind of things, and the big society. Is there a role, does the panel see, for self-employment, which the Young People's Enterprise Partnership definitely sees?
Good question.
I don't know if do you work with Prince's Trust in the West Midlands?
Yes, we have worked in the past.
I was going to say, 'cause that's a big area for us when we're talking about getting young people into work. A key part of what we do is helping young people settle in business. So we have about 3,000 young people a year, and I think at this particular time it's really important because so many young people do have ideas but they need support, and what we find is mentoring. Damon was telling me he used to be a business mentor. That's critical for us, is to make sure we put mentors with the young people who've had the experience and really help them into that business. So we're seeing that as a growing area, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think more the point about it was the engagement between enterprise and education is absolutely key. And I think for self-employment, it's even bigger. Even somebody like me sitting here today, I wouldn't know how to start up a business properly. Let alone people without the opportunities I've had. So I think that engagement is absolutely crucial.
And so the government are trying to do something, aren't they? That sounded a lot like enterprise allowance, which was about
yes,
self-employment as a route well.
Indeed, but with added mentoring and support, which I think possibly addresses the point you raised.
I mean, there've been any number of schemes over the years that look to bridge the income gap, moving from where you are to self-employed. The key issue is always capital. To set it up, if it's £3,000 for a small delivery van to whatever, for the commuter equipment or whatnot. I think the role of the government there is not in giving the loans, but perhaps some sort of loan guarantee system, and take a hit on say 20% of them. But that is a real key to actually starting a business, the capital to get it going. And if you're, a young person, 20, 21, 22, you're hardly likely, unless you're an endowment fund that somebody falls in your lap, which most people do.
I think for me, I think for me is that it's not necessarily just an issue of the capital that you need to start up a business. It's often the fact that people haven't thought about self-employment in the first place.
I would agree. I think it's linked to raising aspirations that Damien was mentioning. It's linked to good careers information, advice and guidance, and perhaps, and I know that this is being looked at, better embedding of not only employability skills but enterprise skills in the curriculum for school and college students, university students.
It's quite striking, the number of how very few people leave welfare for self-employment. It's like less than 1%, given that whatever percentage of the economy as a whole is.
Yeah, capital is also important. I mean, I agree actually with everything, almost everything that's just been said. Actually, government loan guarantee schemes, I don't know anybody here who's ever tried to get a loan on a government loan guarantee scheme. I have, to start a business. And although we were a pretty pucker operation, great business plan and all the rest of it, the bank weren't willing to lend on the back of it, even though it ticked all the criteria. It turned out, because from a public policy perspective, then I was interested in probing the bank on why I think I'm quite a good risk, why I haven't passed this hurdle. The answer was, well, the government will always find something. If you actually did default on the loan, they'd always find a reason not to pay it. And so it's an interesting point, because governments think they're omnipotent, and by pushing a few buttons you can make things happen. But there's human behaviour to deal with as well, and people watching their own backs. Prince's Trust is a source of capital, of course, business loans. CDFIs, Community Development Finance Institutions, an important source, so there's not that many of them. Credit unions will shortly be liberalised to be able to provide loans to organisations as well as to individuals, and all these are important sources. I'd also like to see real sort of microfinance credit being more available. I was very struck sometime we were watching one of these TV documentaries. I think it was the John Prescott thing where he was talking to it was the Prescott and wife go forth documentary, and they met a chap who was on benefits and said, "Oh, I'll be a window cleaner one day." And John Prescott said to him, not unreasonably, "Well, what's wrong with this day to become a window cleaner?" He said, "Well, I can't afford the ladders." And Prescott, of course, was tearing what's left of his hair out, saying, "How much can a ladder cost?" And it was 50 quid or something. Well, where would I get 50 quid? And these are gaps in the provision. It may have been that that particular chap wasn't very good or reliable window cleaner anyway. But there must be the opportunities for people to do that. And that's the challenge. Again, it's not a government provision thing, but a challenge, I think, for government and everybody to help stimulate development.
There was a question right in the middle of our education unit.
So my question's already been covered.
Okay. So there was one over, there's a lady towards the back there in the grey little colours.
I'm Kate Williams. I'm from Treehouse, which is an autism education charity. I was interested in what you were saying, Terry, about understanding who the group of young people not in education, employment and training are. And obviously from my perspective, the first group I think about is young people with disabilities or special educational needs. I know that's an issue in some ways across the age spectrum in terms of working. But I thought, Damien, some of the things that you were saying sort of helped to answer that question. When you're talking about aspiration, I come across so many people who say, "Oh, children with autism," or, the future doesn't look good, whatever, rather than thinking about how we can support those young people earlier on. And you also made a really important point, I thought, about the early years and intervening early. And what we find in our school is that when you can support children with autism to help develop their communication skills, they pick up those skills they need to learn, and therefore obviously their progress develops from there. I'm just wondering what the panel think about how we can be addressing the situation for young people with disabilities or special educational needs, particularly now that we are getting better in education terms at supporting those young people to get the right skills. It seems to me that we're not quite making the bridge yet to support them into employment or work opportunities.
So it's a very good question, two different bits really. Who wants to go first? Take this.
Can I just say one word, which I meant to say earlier and didn't? And this is not specific to children with autism, by the way, but reading. Time and time again, all the work we've done so far, we're going to be on a short time with the education committee, this is something that keeps going up. You can't read, but at the appropriate moment, then everything else goes wrong. It's like a domino effect. Because you can't read, you don't concentrate in class. Because you don't concentrate in class, you don't get, and because. And so putting in additional support to children to make sure that they can read by the appropriate point, I think is absolutely vital. So I realise that's not sort of answering your question directly. But on special needs more broadly, it does have obviously the two subjects do touch.
Well, and what's the answer then, you think? So the national strategies are gone up.
Reformer, yes.
What is the answer in terms of what sort of things are we looking at in terms of?
Well, I think there's been a welcome move in policy terms, both previous government and continued by this government, on more personalised approaches and a more individual-led employment and skills service, so that, for example, Job Centre Plus advisors are encouraged to see the individual in front of them and what they can do rather than what they can't do, and to have the flexibility, and hopefully that will increase under the work programme, to offer, to have the scope to offer a range of choices, or to consider a range of choices that might work for the individual in front of them. So I mean, that's a tough one to pull off, and there's issues about the way welfare to work contractors are paid, and who they're paid on outcomes. So will that incentivise them to sort of cream off the easy to place people? There are all sorts of issues, and we just need to see how it works through. But there's been a definite move and a recognition that people want and deserve a more personalised service, and I think that's to be welcomed generally, and let's see how it pans out.
I suppose we have something similar, and for us it's really working with the employers to really get them to understand who the young people are that we work with and what their particular needs are. And we've found we've had to put in extra mentoring support to work alongside the employers to say, give this person a chance and we'll help and support.
And so what do they do? They're sort of in the workplace with them?
They're there if it's needed, so the employer can call on the person and say, so we have that 6 months on offer. It's quite intense, but it's what we need to do.
It's interesting. And now there were a couple of others. Gentleman here has been very patient, so we'll hear them.
Alex Hatton from the Innovation Unit. We're a social enterprise up on Old Street, work with people who provide public services to find very broadly to help them find innovative solutions to intractable social problems. And this question really comes from something Damien said, but I'm interested in everyone really. I said about not enough sharing of good practice across education, and also a point about where the intellectual property sits when people are developing good practice and new practice. And I was wondering if you have anything in mind for that, really.
I think it's an open question, and of course, let me be absolutely clear. I don't speak for the government or anything crazy like that, but in healthcare we have NICE, which is sort of a centre of excellence understanding of all these things. In education, we kind of, you've got you've got Ofsted, then there's various, third sector organisations.
There was some discussion, I think, about setting up a version of the US. They have a What Works clearinghouse, don't they? And I don't know. DB, I think there is still an ongoing discussion about that, isn't it? I don't know where you.
I don't know, to be honest. I don't know enough to take a view on that. But and it may well be that actually trying to have a single, perfect view of the world might actually be too ambitious, and might actually be too restrictive of people trying things and so on. But somehow you've got to get something which is more streamlined than what there is at the moment, which is one woman in South Shields who's doing something brilliant, and somebody else in South Wales who's doing something also brilliant but completely different, and lots of people are in the middle, they're not real people actually, and lots of other people wondering which one of these two things to copy. So I don't really have the answer, is the short answer. Obviously being a politician, I had to say it in a little more long-winded way.
I think there's a clash here between the ideals of centralism and localism. I think most people would subscribe to every locality has some difference and they should be allowed more flexibility to do things most appropriate. Rather, there are some things that are so important that they should be in a central direction. So I don't think any government would tolerate any school not teaching maths and English, for instance. And I think there are tensions there that need addressing. I think the other real problem you've got, not universally, because to very large parts in secondary schools, is competition for pupils. I'll say no more than that.
If I maybe add something, it was linked to the point that I mentioned about getting smarter about the way we communicate messages to employers, for example. I think there's never been a better time for quickly and fairly cheaply sharing good practice in terms of using social media, fora that people relate to. People start up their own kind of self-help fora now, and it seems to me these are excellent mediums for sharing good practice. And really, we've never had it better in terms of getting messages out there or or asking, just putting a question, I'm trying to do this with my class or whatever, or to make links. Anybody got any ideas? And people pile in. It's quite remarkable when you click, you know, when you go into these forums, or you even, you know, Google YouTube and say, who can help me get my SIM port card out of my iPhone? You know, there's 10 people there just showing you how to do it, which is very.
What is the answer?
Well, it's tricky, Damien, but I'll show you afterwards.
This is where we need 12 people. Who was the lady who looked like she wanted to jump in
I
on
just
this?
wanted to, make a point, thank you. My name's Sue Southwood, I work for NIAS, the National Institute for Adults Continuing Education, and we've done quite a lot of work with youth organisations, people who work with young people in this area, and there is a free downloadable publication produced by the NRDC in London, Success Factors in Working with Young People, all based on what young people themselves have said about how they like to learn.
That's the big question. Now, there were two more questions. We'll go here and then here.
More around inclusion. One thing which I haven't quite come across is the spectrum of need young people. Because we've got the people at the one end who may be NEET for the whole time, high risk of youth crime, a whole lot. And the other end, we've got people who maybe NEET sometimes, drop in and out of college courses, then never get picked up by the career service following on. And some of those would kind of be at risk because of not being able to pay for their bus fares once the EMAs are gone and that kind of stuff. So we need to have a feeling that there is a spectrum, and some people are probably easier to help than others. And that there may possibly be what the last government called quick wins. If you identify where in the spectrum you're trying to work. So that's sort of thing.
Yeah, thank you. And do you think there's something that can be done in terms of the work programme to put different prices on different fields ends?
Well, the work programme isn't dealing with 16 and 17-year-olds.
Yes, you're right.
So 16 and 17-year-olds are covered by the increase in participation age, which would be very difficult to get to work.
Yeah.
Once they're 18, then they'll be covered by the work programme, and more may be done. I mean, the New Deal was much more effective for the 18 pluses. 16 and 17s was where the NEET stayed high in the entire period. And I suspect that the career service, or the lack of the career service updating itself to the current modern environment is probably partly responsible for that.
Very interesting. Should we go across, straight across the way?
Okay, Mukesh Oz from SoCo Knowledge Schools and Children's Services. Actually, just following on from Paul's comments, to what extent did you actually think the problems around transitionary support? Because the reality is that locally commissioned services are probably better placed to support 14 to 19-year-olds. Yet Jobs Plus provision doesn't kick in until they're 18, and actually a lot of 18 and 19-year-olds don't engage with Jobs Plus if they're already NEET. And so perhaps a solution might be to evolve that authority down so that Jobs Plus provision doesn't begin until 19, and therefore you would lose people.
Yeah, connections are supposed to sort of deal with it.
Well, it's not outcome focused, so the primary bit for connections would be to have leaver interviews, which was all.
Who wants to sort of talk about this bit of the sort of career?
The ideal is that, and again, we're talking general, I suppose the total place is made to work. Those that don't know, total place is where all the different government budgets in an area are brought together for maximum impact. That may be a bit idealistic. And I mean, just one contradiction that sums all this up. Somebody going into a sixth form at school, that school gets approximately £5,000 for that pupil, whatever happens. If that same individual goes to college, they get slightly less, but essentially the same. But if that person leaves, they have to repay the money. School keeps it, the college loses it. But different attractions and incentives then as to what's going on. We should be having common rules around. I don't care whether both keep it or both lose it, but it's a nonsense that two providers are treated differently.
anyone else want to take up on this point about the...
I think it's a good point about the transition and that people can fall through the cracks in that 16 to 18 age group. I'm wondering whether the move to an all-age careers service might alleviate that problem, in that there will be somebody there for the continuum, you would hope, for young people who are at most risk of that. But, you know, I think that is a real issue.
Sounds to me like we need a quantum.
I think one of the things is actually that whilst changes have taken place in the world back to work model in terms of outcome-based contracting, in the skills and employment model, that how can actually providers holding on to learners rather than actually delivering what's best for them, or they might be focused on delivering qualification rather than actually being measured on outcomes into employment.
It's certainly different sort of attempts to do different things with skills spending. So you had individual learning accounts at one point. One attempts to do it, you sort of attempt to rationalise those quangos. Is there something big and obvious that can be done with all that skill spending? I mean, Alison Wolf is reviewing all this stuff at the moment for the government. They're about to publish a white paper, I think, as well.
And that's for the 14 to 19. It's that join, isn't it, that's the tricky one to ensure that people don't fall through.
Do you think our skill spending is well spent at the moment? No. Anyone would disagree with that?
Well, I think the answer actually is we probably don't know. We know how well the skill spending is doing, as you mentioned, in terms of how many people are achieving qualifications. I think what we are advocating that we should be able to know more, and the public, the consumers, should be able to know more about the impact of the training that's going on. So, you know, what does it mean for people who have gone on this course? Did they get a job? Did they progress to higher learning? Did their wages go up? Was there a good high satisfaction level? So we think that skills programmes should be much more transparent in terms of giving the public more information, and not only about how their programmes, where their programmes are taking people, but also what's the impact of having on their communities and local economies. So I think we probably don't know actually the full impact of the skills trend at the moment.
And we're coming towards the end, but there's a couple of gentlemen who go for government towards the back.
Thank you. Matthew Frim from Working Links. Since 2000 we've helped 44,500 young people into work, and by and large we do that by working with every individual and giving them the employability skills, the confidence, the motivation that they need to be able to enter into the job market. We work closely with employers as well. And I think you picked up on it, Damien. The bit that's missing for me is, why do we have to do that? Because I'm not sure it's happening at schools, and I'm not sure why it isn't happening at schools. Fundamentally, I think there was an article that came out in the Times last year that said 7 out of 10 teachers didn't think that preparing young people to work was anything to do with what they were doing. And I think that we've become so caught up in getting schools to pass GCSEs and achieve the top at league tables. On the work programme, we'll be looking at 2 years sustained job outcomes. Quite right, because no point getting somebody into work if they're not going to stay in work. Schools should have sustained outcomes 2 years after they leave school, because it's interesting to measure schools on how their NEET proportions are, as opposed to how high their GCSE results are. And I just wondered if we really need to engage with schools more in this argument around preparing young people for a life of work.
Okay, that's an intriguing thought. But can you measure, should you be trying to get schools to focus on what I would think of as what you might call soft skills, it's not words, you know, all those other things that aren't, all the things that are in the pupils that aren't their qualifications. I don't know if there are any measures of that.
But universities do it, don't they?
Yes, because they do. You have the UCAS process is sort of doing that, interviewing people.
Well, I don't know whether you should be doing it or not, but don't stop doing it. It's quite important. We have become exam obsessed with secondary schools, and specifically, as I was saying, obsessed around this sort of cliff edge point about 5+, C+. I mean, when I was at school, you did all these things, you just did them. You didn't need to be on a national curriculum or part of a systematisation or programmisation programme. You just did them. You learned how to write a letter, you learned what a CV was, you learned how to, you know, just put your best foot forward. And I'm sure many schools do that now. But sadly, we've crammed the curriculum full of so much that if you want to find space for anything, the answer is always stick another module on PSHE. please God, if anybody here is involved in that, please don't stick it up. If I can get rid of PSHE if it's all possible, because it's more systematisation and programmisation. One of my specialist areas is debt, and I hear people all the time saying, well, the way to deal with the indebtedness problem of people and going to doorstep loans is another module on PSHE. No, it's not. It's teaching basic maths and responsibility and understanding of the possibilities of life. So I think as well as just schools sort of doing it because it's the right thing to do, there is a way that actually you can make sure that particularly foundation level GCSEs are more practically focused without dumbing down the sort of academic content, particularly in the higher paper. But in the foundation level, in maths I'd like to see more focus on debt and that sort of thing, and in English and so on, more focus on writing a letter, doing a CV and all sorts of things that are related to work.
There was another question. There's a gentleman towards back, and then we'll come forward with something.
Thank you. I'm Daniel Robinson from Green Partnership. There's something really quite strange here and agree completely with our colleague from Working Links. I'd just like to reiterate every single thing that he said and still keep that on the table as an agenda in terms of why are we having to do this for the people once they've left school. Even people I've worked alongside have been of the mind of learning some things around, Maslow's theory of motivation, so on and so forth. Actually, if I'd learned this at school, I'd be a millionaire by now. And it's really about getting those fundamental skills, not just the sort of more left field stuff like that, but more fundamental skills for not just employability skills, but understanding, helping young people to understand what an employer is looking for, where their current skill set falls into that, and how they can actually have an action plan from quite a young age to actually develop that. What we've got is, what do you like doing? Okay, well, it's important to do a job that you like. No, it's not. It's important to do a job that's buoyant in the labour market, that you actually have a chance of being employed in once you do leave school. And I think that's the message that we're really missing in the schools. I don't know if anyone on the panel would like to respond to that.
And that is the flip side. I was talking earlier about aspiration and lack of aspiration. That's absolutely true. But there is a flip side to this as well, which is entitlement. And it's the whole idea that if I want to do that, then I should be able to do that. And you're absolutely right. The sort of attitude that most people are 10, 20 years younger, older, than the 16, 24 years we're talking about. It was different in those days in terms of what your expectations were. You went where the money was, as it were. You didn't expect it to come and find you.
But they don't have to be mutually exclusive then. This is the thing. You can say, okay, well, you want to do that, so your first step is to get a job in this sector,
yeah, absolutely,
and then we'll progress you through.
So I'm not trying to make it a binary thing. Of course you're right, and of course we should encourage kids. I forget who else was talking about the lady on the cruise ship. Great, but unfortunately there's not quite enough cruise ships to go around. So, but obviously when that can be done, it's fantastic. And also, if somebody wants to be a rock star, maybe you're not going to be a rock star, but maybe you can learn about being a sound technician. And by the way, if you learn about being a sound technician, there's all sorts of things in electronics you can do.
I think there's not enough discussion in the wider agenda around entry-level jobs and how important those are as a foundation in everybody's career, not just your graduate. And the reason why most companies nowadays are actually plumbing for graduates is because A, they don't have a clue what they're actually looking for in an employee. And the second element is that's the only guarantee they've got, that someone's been educated to a reasonable level. It doesn't not necessarily true, but that is their perspective, that is their perception of it, and that's what's causing a lot of young people to be overlooked.
As long as we never get to the stage where education is just seen as a production line for employers, it's going to be far more than that. If that's all it was, we'd never teach history or philosophy for a start.
But it's a production line for employment, which is slightly different and is very important.
And I think one of the things that we found, we were looking at issues around how do you incentivise a system to embed these, we call them employability skills, but they're really life skills as well as work skills. And we find that the skills that teachers need to teach employability skills are generally speaking the skills that good teachers need anyway. So it's using action learning techniques, appropriate assessment that's appropriate to what you're trying to measure. So it could be a very practical thing, and they need to be in any subject. You can do that. It could be geography or woodworking. It doesn't have to be a vocational subject. And above all, young people and employers value being resilient, being able to recognise that actions have consequences, and to bounce back from failures, to say, well, that's life and I've learned from it, and to be able to speak about what they've learned, articulate it. So, you know, I think there is a lot more that can be done in preparing teachers and in training teachers for this kind of stuff, because it is life as well as work skills.
Just two last questions. So one over here, there's a lady in the middle, and then one over on the left-hand side.
Hi, my name's Laurie. Oh, hello. I work for Stonewall, the lesbian, gay and bisexual rights organisation. I manage all their youth engagement. We do a number of programmes with young people, most of whom, well, a lot of whom are NEET, lesbian, gay young people, who've left school because of homophobic bullying and been discriminated against and things like that. So they've got a lot of extra barriers, I think, getting into employment, especially sort of psychologically, than maybe your average NEET young person. One of the big programmes we do with them is volunteering, which is something that hasn't been talked much about, but I see it as something that's really valuable in addressing this problem, and it is a way we've found to keep them motivated and to teach them a lot of life skills. If they're doing regular volunteering, to, you know, get them into a pattern that might kind of be like working life, so that when they do find a job, they're a bit more prepared and motivated, and, you know, they have got some experience that might be relevant. But yeah, as I said, it hasn't really been mentioned as much of a tool today, and we're losing a lot of funding next year for this. Do you think it's got a role to play, like volunteering? Do you think it's an important thing that the third sector should be kind of keep our resources providing youth volunteering opportunities? And do you think it's got an important role to play in addressing getting more young people into employment?
Yeah, I think, you know, for instance, it's key. We also offer young people volunteering within our own organisation, but also promote it elsewhere. I suppose we've also been lucky, I don't know if you've had funding from V, but V was obviously pushing a lot of money to help people increase the volunteering opportunities, which I don't think will exist going forward. I think it's a way to help young people get the skills, but I think still all young people say to us, fine, we really enjoy volunteering, but we want to work, we want money. So it's definitely a route to work, but I think I would just caution the whole idea of sort of long-term volunteering. We're talking to DWP about there is a role for volunteering, but not all the time. It's got to lead to work, and young people have got to see where the work's going to come from.
There's a last question over on the right there.
My name's Ryan Robson. I imagine Partner Sovereign Capital will be back a number of work providers. I just wondered if the panel had considered the contradiction that private sector organisations like Working Links and Serco, private sector capital is always called upon by governments of both administrations to deal with the problem cases. So, you know, we, for example, back the second largest fostering business in the country, when kids being fed by the care system and a number of welfare work providers. But private capital is not allowed because of political squeamish to get involved in the state school sector at the start of the process. So when we're looking at social return on investment, should we also be allowed private sector providers to make a profit out of normal children, not just those that are considered ill or problems?
You could get me in an awful lot of trouble answering that question. Actually, on financing in general, I think, and this came up earlier about the perennial problem of this year's budget. In other words, you know, you've got programmes that are proven to work, or pretty much proven to work, where you know that by intervening with people in difficulties and so on, you know that somewhere down the line there's going to be a saving. Some good work going on at the moment on ex-offenders in that regard, just sort of starting. The problem is we don't really have the sort of financial products to cash flow that process. And I think the private sector, only the private sector will come up with the genius ideas that are necessary to do that. In terms of state schools, I just don't think there's public appetite for the kind of thing you've spoken about. I think there's plenty of and there's plenty of energy and willingness without the sort of private sector financing that you're talking about in order to achieve the goals that everyone wants to see.
Anyone else want to take up on this podcast?
I'll just make an observation, and this is in no way criticism of the private sector, but on the welfare to work, with the last government, it's extensively used in the private sector. It's not, I don't think, because it's particularly any innovatory superiority there. You know, Job Centre Plus has got a fantastic track record of placing people to work. I think it's all about the transfer of risk. But I think it's ironic that the two most successful